Okay, so we can talk a little bit about what we've learned, as was mentioned earlier. Learnt about being ambitious for people. I think that's, Chris talks about having adventures. We talk about being ambitious. Yeah, there's always more, as you will find out as you talk to some of the people over the next 2 or 3 days. There's always more than the system believes can happen. Yeah. Okay. So just a little example. Kula and Vasilis know this fella. His name's Manoli. Unfortunately, he's been very ill since then. His life has not been a lot better. But you look at Manoli's life. Where'd you start? I start from the perspective that this is a guy that speaks 3 languages. You wouldn't look at him and say, "Oh, he speaks 3 languages," would you? But it's an important starting point. But for me, although there's a life for me before all of this, where I was a youth and community worker, a teacher, for a brief period of time till I discovered that the only reason I wanted to work in an institution was to close it. I was a psychiatric nurse, and eventually a psychologist. But my life, as far as this work really comes together, started with these things, which are institutions, English institutions and Scottish institutions. And particularly this one, which is Borough Court, which was the focus of what was called the silent minority scandal that led to allegedly the closure of all the institutions in England after the scandal at the end of the 1980s. What I learned, we'll go through some of the process, but it started there. I was recruited by the National Development Team when it was part of the Secretary of State, the Health Secretary's domain, not an independent organisation, to actually investigate what had been going on at Borough Court. And I was involved in that because we'd already started, where I was running services in the Midlands, we'd already started closing institutions, and we'd learnt a lot about how to do it. But you walk into these places and immediately you have to come to the conclusion that eugenics is alive and well. We walk still into the places that we go into, various people here go into every week, and we say eugenics is alive and well. Does everybody understand that term? Does everybody know what eugenics are? Do tell me if you don't. I don't. Okay. Eugenics was a movement, actually, at the beginning of the 20th century. Lots and lots of public systems were set up on the basis that we should stop disabled people breeding, and we should stick people in institutions and separate them by sex, because they weren't real people. And and people like Churchill, great hero, actually bought into this stuff. Essentially the stock of the nation would be spoilt if we didn't intervene in this. It all comes together still in this sort of notion that people with disabilities are not whole people, are not real people, and it doesn't take very long for service systems and political systems then to categorise people into groups to be managed, not to be recognised as true individuals. Now, in these contexts, we started off in Borough Court, but as soon as we started dealing with the stuff in Borough Court, all these other hospital closures were going on, and because we were starting to address things from a different perspective, we were asked to help with those as well. And so what was the perspective we were coming from? We were coming from a perspective that said a lot of these people had been brutalised, had been abused, had been dehumanised, and therefore they were bloody hard to be with. But that wasn't their fault, that was our fault, And we needed to do something very differently. And when we were closing Borough Court, between the group of hospitals that were involved in that, there were about 1,500 people. And amongst that 1,500 people, there were 108 people where we just said, there is nothing that exists and nobody that we can work with that can work with these people. And so we've got to invent it from scratch. And we started off from a perspective of saying we don't know what to do, which is a really important thing to say. We don't know how to do this. Let's not pretend we know how to do it. Everything we know doesn't work, you know? So let's start somewhere else. So that's where we started from with the borough court stuff. I'll tell you about Ray in a minute. What we said was, we know what doesn't work. We looked at the way in which the systems that did exist were responding to people who'd acquired very challenging reputations, and said, isn't it, you know, we're forcing people who behave bizarrely to live with people who behave bizarrely? That's a weird thing to do. But it's even weirder than when we ask the staff to behave bizarrely as well, you know? Which we do, don't we? You know, all this behavioural management stuff, all the, you know, we ask staff to do things that are not natural, you know? It's weird. You know, how do we learn not to be bizarre? We learn from good models, don't we? Not from anything else. So we recognised that the people that we were working with were being blamed for the failure of the system. Well, actually, it was the system that needed to be blamed. And we needed to be clear about what success would look like, what our purpose was, what our principles were, what we were trying to do. And we came to a very clear, you know, I had a very small leadership team. You know, I'd taken over this hospital to close it. I had a finance director, I had a head of operations, and I had a head of psychology, and me. And we decided, you know, we can't ask anybody else to do this because we don't know how to do it, so we better go and do it. Now, how many leaders in public organisations anymore decide they're going to go and live with one person at a time? You know, which is what we did. We started learning by doing it. Not by having clever ideas and then theoretically training other people to do this stuff, because we didn't know how to do it, so how could we train them how to do it, you know? Ray is a prime example. Ray was one of the 108 people we worked with who nobody wanted to work with. You know, it's quite easy to get close to people who thump you. It's not easy to get close to people who forcibly make themselves vomit, who stick metal objects into every orifice in their body, who bleed a lot. You know, it's hard to get close to people who self-injure, you know? And Ray severely self-injured. And he'd been in an institution since he was 14 years old, and he sort of moved, and he'd been actually in the children's institution that had led to the closure of all the children's institutions. So he'd been in the Smith Hospital at Henley, where there were major scandals, and eventually just get rid of it had been the only solution. But for people like him, it wasn't a solution because they just moved those people into the adult system. Strangely, we learnt by living with Ray over about 2 or 3 years. We gradually recruited a team to replace us. That's how we worked. We work with somebody, we work out in a sort of direction of travel, we then recruit a manager and we work alongside them, and then they would recruit their staff team, and then we would move out and it would move on. But with Ray, it took 3 years, I think, before the police stopped being called and he stopped barricading himself in his bedroom and having to be dragged off to hospital. But we saw it through. And we came out the other end, and Ray was doing the gardening for his next door neighbour and was inviting us for Sunday lunch because they loved nothing more than to cook dinner for everybody. And he got a life. He shared his house, because that was the way it was in those days, with 2 ladies who both had mental health issues. And things were going really swimmingly. And then Ray, who by this time was in his 60s, fell over, he broke his hip, he had to have surgery, and then the system got hold of him again. And the system said, oh, he can't go back to living in that service because he can't climb stairs anymore. The people he lived with said, he can come back, of course he can, we can turn the living room into. And we were saying as an organisation, yeah, and we can put a bathroom on the ground floor. It's not an issue. Oh, no. You can't talk to us because of you're being paid to provide a service. So what you say doesn't matter. You know. So the long and the short of it was, Ray was placed in an old people's home, and he lasted there for a day and a half. They took him there strapped in a wheelchair because he refused to go. After a day and a half, they moved him to a psychiatric hospital. He set fire to it. And then they moved him to what was allegedly a specialist service, where Ray was confronted with people he'd met when he was in the institution. And he decided he was going to die, and he set about doing it. And at that point, actually the person who'd been the manager of the first service that we'd set up for him, and then had gone off to have children and was living in a different part of the country, emerged as a really strong advocate. And she took him home with her. She walked into this specialist service, stuck him in her car and took him home, and they did nothing about it. And from there on in, they came back to us and said, can you provide for him? And he ended up basically having the life of Riley, because he could, you know, we met with the public authority. It was also the housing authority, not just the social services authority for him. I won't mention the city, but it is in the south of England and not far from London. Begins with R. And they said, can you sort this out, please? You know, we said, well, we wouldn't have been here if you'd listened to us in the first place. Well, yeah, please, can you sort it out? Yeah, well, we can. We just need somewhere for him to live. You're the housing authority. Take 2-3 years. So I sent the local manager down the road to all the letting agents, and we came back with a gang of things, and we presented them to Ray. He chose the nicest flat next to the Thames at Caversham, if anybody knows Reading. Moved in. They paid the supplement because they were stuck, and he lived his life out till he died there. There's a film. That's why that disc is there. If we had time, we'd show it you. But it's a film that before Ray died, he asked to be made about his life. Yeah. But what we learnt in this, you know, this service and systems context to all of this. You've got to put what was going on in England and Wales and the UK generally at the end of the 80s and beginning of the 90s in a political context. In the UK, in England, we'd only had social services departments, somebody correct me, but I think it was since 1971 or 72. And social services departments were set up within local authorities. They were set up very locally. I was a social worker in a social services department. I had a patch. You know, I worked a part of a city. I knew I could walk the streets of the area and I didn't need a car to do my job. I knew everybody that did anything. I knew the people that ran the kids' football team. I knew if so-and-so needed somebody to look after their kids because they were in hospital or had to visit somebody or whatever, I knew who I could go to in that street and all that stuff. It was local. That's how we operated. And we had a couple of reports on the development of social services departments. At the end of the 70s, a report conducted by Seabohm. And then in 1982, another report called the Barclay Report, which basically said, we're going in the right direction. And there's a lovely quote in it that says, if the social needs of citizens are to be met in the last years of the 20th century, the personal social services must develop a close working partnership with citizens, focusing more closely on the community and its strengths. A move to what we are calling community social work is the start of such a development. And there was consensus over that. It was really, really messy, but it worked, you know. And then along came a certain Margaret Thatcher. And a politician who decided, and she said this, there is no such thing as society. No such thing as society. Society is a group of individuals pursuing their own goals, is how she described how we live together. But she also said, all this stuff is socialism. Now, bugger it isn't socialism, it's community. All this stuff is socialism, we can't have that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use the economy to destroy this. And she was very, all this stuff that is, and this other quote here, is quoted out of the press of the time. Stuff that she actually said, nothing hidden. I'm going to use economics as the model to destroy this stuff. I'm going to make people consumers, And what she did was she changed our system overnight from one where we muddled through, mixing up what we could do for each other with how we could use a bit of public resource in order to make things work, and we were doing it at a heavy level with people with very challenging needs, but that's exactly what we were doing, into a thing of where you assess people not for their potential, not for their best life, but you assess people for their deficiencies. And the more deficiencies you've got, the more likely you are to be eligible for some help. It's balmy, isn't it? Really, really stupid. But that's the environment that we've lived in now for the last 35 years in this country. It's an environment that basically says the state's only interested in you and will provide allegedly a comprehensive service for you, which you can't. If we were to go through the training we do with public servants, the first thing I would have done with you is to ask what really matters to you. I'm not going to do that because it takes an hour to do it. But I'll tell you what really matters to me, and it's what we've shown, and the research that was done by our colleagues at Plan years and years ago sort of reinforces it. The stuff that was done there and with Ashoka, wasn't it? Basically says we all come up, it doesn't matter whether we're rich, poor, we're in a refugee camp, we live on a yacht in the Mediterranean, it doesn't really matter. Relationships, love, belonging, enough wealth to have a bit of choice, an opportunity to be a contributing citizen and to have the respect of others, have a place where we can be ourselves that we call home, and as a consequence of that, feeling safe and secure. Those are the things that really matter. That doesn't, this service thing doesn't address that. As Rob was saying earlier, a service will never love you. And there'll be loads of people within the service that say they do. But ask them where they're going to be in 5 years' time. That's the test of it. So, another friend of ours from Plan. This is Al only 3 years ago. In an introduction to a book a friend of ours wrote, he said, our social welfare institutions are undemocratic. They're designed to manage, to ignore natural relationships, to eliminate reciprocity, to restrict eligibility, to enable the few to control the many, to provide order, consistency and predictability, and to minimise controversy. To maximise compliance. They turn beneficiaries into clients. The record shows that institutional decision-making undermines citizen action. It ignores community solutions, it increases dependency, and preserves resources to maintain out-of-date approaches. So if you sort of nail down what Life Through Friends is about, it is about doing something different to that. Okay? Right. And then we get to the easy bit. If we're going to start to do that, then it seems to me there's something we need to do first. We need to be clear about what our purpose is. Now, that's the opposite of that statement is our purpose in a sense. But our purpose is about enabling people to have the best life that they can possibly have and doing whatever is necessary to get there. And there are a whole gang of principles which are about how we live together as human beings in our society that underpin that. And we can have conversations about what those things amount to. But for me, that's crucial. There was another scandal. Anybody heard of Winterbourne? Winterbourne View? We had another scandal in 2010. And, to our government's surprise at least, they discovered that there were things like that going on in services that were costing $500,000 a person. You know, it's allegedly services. This young lady actually, who's the victim in that thing, was the person who was the centre of the exposure that was done by Panorama, a BBC documentary programme. And we ended up, a long time afterwards, nearly a decade afterwards, you know, it's only when they're embarrassed, we were saying earlier, that we get asked to help. Her public authorities, both the health and social services authorities of her you know, responsible for funding her support, had sent her the other side of the country into equally stupid circumstances where, you know, she was significantly abused again. They brought her back into a local provision that was supposed to be her home and turned out to be a 5-place, what's called an ATU, assessment and treatment unit. Was never intended to be that. And, you know, they wasted another 10 years of this young woman's life. Anyway, that's the story. The issue is, you know, we can get very, very clear about the way forward if we're very clear about what our purpose is. Now, if our purpose is about getting somebody their best life and then doing whatever is necessary to get there, then that's how we ought to organise the way in which we provide service, surely. You know? So I'm going to take you through really now what we did at Borough Court and not what we've grown through doing. I guess we only discovered this after we'd been doing it for years, and I discovered this off sort of asset-based community development people and people like John McKnight and co. But yeah, what we'd been doing was something that's now got a label. It's called appreciative inquiry. And what we've been doing was actually discovering what the best would be, dreaming about how we could get there, researching that, designing a plan, and then doing it. And recognising that it's a journey, that you can't just go out and do it. You know, it will maybe take 10 years, sometimes it will take 20 years, but you've got to know the direction of travel. And we learned over this time from a whole gang of people. We learned from asset-based community development. That's a picture of John McKnight, just for those of you who don't know him. We learned from the Barclay report. We learned from Al's Good Life book, which sort of described in sort of an easy access guide to how to do the planned thing. You know? We learned also by going and spending time with these people. We spent time in Canada. We spent time in the States with John. We didn't just, you know, sort of pick up stuff and then try and interpret it. We actually went and experienced how people were doing it. And we also took hard evidence seriously, and we built a relationship, and you'll hear from Simon Pickthall on Friday. We built a relationship with the Vanguard folk, John Seddon's organisation, Professor John Seddon's organisation, who increasingly, when they looked at public authorities and how they did their business, came to the conclusion that they were wasting huge amounts of money by doing the wrong thing. And then they demonstrated it, and still government wouldn't listen to them because of what they're basically saying is the opposite of what Mrs. Thatcher was saying and what had become normal. And concurrently, we, as you'll hear, had learnt that, you know, our professionals in every support arrangement we set up, we weren't employing care assistants or support workers or whatever. We were employing intelligent human beings. We were employing people that could solve problems, that didn't need to run off to the psychologist or the psychiatrist or the commissioner or whatever just because there were problems, that they were professionals who took serious personal responsibility for getting stuff done. And we'd learnt that we'd almost institutionalised out of the way in which support staff operate the notion that they might be able to do something without asking, you know? Complete opposite of what happens here. Okay. So let's start at the beginning. You're going to meet Joe on tomorrow. He might be there tonight. He'll be there tonight, won't he? Yeah. Joe is one of our board members. This is Joe when I first met him. A man absolutely stressed out of his mind with Asperger's, in a service that was dominating him and stressing him and making his life miserable. Joe will tell his story, and I'm not going to tell you the detail of it, but there's just one important part of it. I spend a lot of time with Joe. He'll tell you how we got together. It was pure chance. Getting him to tell me what his best life would be like, because he's an intelligent bloke. And all he could tell me was about how pissed off he was, basically, and how upset he was, and what a terrible time he was having. And eventually he lost his temper with me because I pressed it. This is over months. We used to meet in Wetherspoons to get him out of the service environment. And eventually he shouted at me in public, which he was very embarrassed about. And he said, "For Christ's sake, Bob, I want to pay tax." Now, how many of us have ever said that? I said, "Joe, why do you want to pay tax?" He said, "Because you're not a person till you pay tax, are you? You're not real." And, you know, basically these people are throwing all this money at making me miserable, but they've taken my agency away, you know. So then it was really easy. Okay, you want to pay tax? What are we going to do, mate? Well, I need an education. I missed out on my education. I need this. I want a home of my own. I don't want people hanging around. I can't cope with people. People drive me mad. All that stuff. Consequence was, 4.5 years later, that's Joe getting his degree. Because we discovered that if you ask, people are helpful. And South Wales University were helpful. Yeah, of course. Yeah, you know, come on, you know, we'll let you do a degree in 6 years, they said. Well, he did it in 4, and he only did it in 4 because he changed courses at the end of the first year. So, but anyway, Joe will tell you his story. But assessing ambitiously for the best we can envisage is the starting position. And as I said, if you're going to take that forward with a group of people supporting somebody on that journey, we need to be working with people who are intelligent and who solve problems and who create opportunities. We're going to do some of that later this afternoon. And pure chance, again, these things happen. I was a member of a network called something or other, the CAN network it was. Community Action Network, that was it. And these guys that had come out of, just left university and set up their business, they were organisational psychologists, had set up a business called Go Make a Difference Thinking. And what they were basically selling was, doing their doctorates, they had, instead of exploring deficits in people, which is what most psychologists do, they'd actually investigated how people who are successful think. And they came to the conclusion that people who are successful think in very similar ways, and that what they do is actually very accessible. We can all do it. And so they produced this book, and they'd given the network 100 copies to distribute. And I just ended up with one on my desk, and I read it. And I went and talked to them and said, "Look, I've got a problem. We're setting up these really, really challenging, complex arrangements around some people who've had a bad time. And things go really well, and then we have to back off to work with the next person. And then we seem to be forever called back to solve problems. You know, we feel like we're constantly in demand, like knights on white chargers, to come and solve things. But actually, when we sit down after we've done it and we talk with the staff about what went on, they knew what to do, they just didn't do it. Now, why is that? And we thought, well, we need to change the culture. We need to change the culture so that those people feel valued enough that they can take responsibility for this stuff. So we got this team with our leadership team to teach us this process. It takes 5 days to do it. And then we had another 5 days where they taught us how to teach it. And then we cascaded it in every service that we worked in. And would you believe, from being never off duty, we were and always on call, within 5 or 6 months we were never being called. Because we'd found a way of enabling people to take responsibility. Simple stuff. But it's really, really important stuff, because that's not what we see happening in mainstream services at all. Another picture from Plan. That's David. My story is, when I watch his film, I still burst into tears every time, because I arrived the week after his funeral.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I came across all these people in bits. Yeah, yeah. But that's the other message, in a sense. It's relationships with the kid. It doesn't matter what your clinical and behavioural knowledge is. If you don't have the relationship, it won't make a damn bit of difference. So the other thing we observed about the people that we were working with in Borough Court, and then in Lennox Castle, and then in Little Plumstead, and then in Meanwood, and all these other institutions around the place, was a huge number of them had nobody in their lives at all. There was no family advocate, let alone any sort of natural advocate. If you asked people who their friends were, it was very often a member of staff that they'd only known for 6 months. It was, and that for us, we'd got to the point where we were really clear that if we were going to sustain what we were trying to do, we had to find ways for those people to have relationships with people who'd made an investment in their lives, and where there was reciprocity going on. And that's the point at which I started doing a search and came across Planned Lifetimes advocacy networks. And I sent an email off to, I think it was Vicky, and had a few conversations, and then got invited to go and spend some time with them. And from there on, we've had a relationship ever since. But this is just an example of what I mean when I talk about social capital and I talk about networks and relationship networks. This is a lad called Kieran. Kieran was somebody not with the challenge behaviour at all. It was a situation where his family had approached us. And his family had approached us because Kieran was coming towards the end of his time in a special school. They were concerned that he would just be processed, probably into some nothing course in a college, and then into a day centre somewhere. And they wanted more for him. And so we got to know Kieran, and what we got to know about Kieran was that Kieran wanted to be a rugby player. And at the time we were doing something with the Scottish Rugby Union, which was helping the Scottish Rugby Union make non-contact rugby available to loads of people with different disabilities. So we'd got a little bit of experience in this area, and so we just approached his local rugby club. And we discovered, as I already knew actually, that on a Sunday morning they had their junior and younger kids sections meeting, but they had nothing going on for disabled kids. So we persuaded them that they ought to set something up, and we sort of used Kieran's relationships in school and whatever to talk to a whole gang of families of kids with disabilities, and we set up a disabled group, which we tried to integrate into the main thing. Now, that wasn't enough for Kieran. Kieran wanted to play rugby. He didn't want to play touch rugby. He didn't want to. He wanted to bash people. But Kieran had Downs, and the first concern of any sports coach around somebody with Downs is that maybe I forgot the name of the bone in your neck, but there is a bone in your neck that can be difficult for somebody with Downs. So we got that checked and he was fine. So the consequence was Kieran then was able to play with the other kids. And at the end of the day, this is Kieran getting the Player of the Year award, playing with Shrewsbury under-17s, not because he had a disability, but because he scored more tries that year than anybody else. And that wasn't the end of the story, because of one of his colleagues in the team was the son of a local painter and decorator. And the local painter and decorator got to know Kieran's parents. And his wife got to know Kieran's parents. And they were part of a network of people that were starting to do things together. And so Kieran's dad was saying to them, look, I'm really concerned that what's going to happen when he leaves school. And the other dad said, well, you can come and work for me. I'll take him on as apprentice. So Kieran went off to be a painter and decorator, and to the best of my knowledge still is, because of the network that had been established around him. Now, in terms of Kieran, there's lots of people that we've taken out of institutions where we've deliberately set up a network. If you were to watch Ties That Bind or one of the other planned films, you know, you would see a much more structured thing. There's loads of stuff that we do about building networks for people which are much more fluid. I guess there is for the stuff you guys do as well. Yeah. So, you know, essentially, Kieran broke out of a system that was going to trap him. Not because of the system, but because of things that were offered from his community, from his relationships.
So just so I'm clear, is that the picture on the left and the picture where the award is happening?
Yeah.
It's the same person?
Yep. Yeah, he changed a lot. That's when he started playing. He became this honed athlete.
Yes, and in his body. In his body, right?
Yeah.
What I see between those two would be a person who is owning his body.
Yeah.
It's just an observation. I thought
It is.
It's not the same person. But so I wanted to make sure I was having the right thought.
Yeah, that was fairly early in the process,
Yeah.
and that's him by the time he's looking like the rest of the team, turning up in his grey his grey jacket and his tie, and yeah. And he's lost 30 pounds, and yeah.
Thank you.
Right. The other thing, you know, I've talked all about community and relationships and networks. We're talking about people who are really hard to be with, and we're only just going to talk about behaviour and managing behaviour, because we think that's the right way round to do it. If we're preoccupied, as most of the system is, with, what do we call it in the UK now? Positive behaviour support. Why do we have to call it positive? It's either behaviour support or it's not. Most of it is not it's not behaviour support. It's still behaviour control and behaviour change, modification focused. It's still focused on fixing people rather than creating environments in which other bits of people can emerge. Yeah. What we learned fairly quickly, and Andy's going to be with us later and tomorrow, and we learned a lot of it from Andy, but we learned it from our own experience as well, was when we got to an environment where we knew how to not be stress causers, when we understood people well enough, and we can put all sorts of clever language, we can talk about the sensory stressors and all those sorts of things. But actually, when you're with people, you don't necessarily have to have that assessment to learn that stuff sort of implicitly. It comes through. But we do that stuff, and Studio 3 and our colleagues in that organisation help us understand what is stressing people. And then we design how we ask people to be with them, to take those things into account. We also do a lot of other stuff, but the most important stuff that we've learned is that when people get lives worth living, when there are things to look forward to, when there are people who are in a reciprocal relationship with them, then strangely, they don't seem to be so stressed and they don't seem to be so challenging. It's sort of surprising that, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. As Rob was saying this morning, we get to that point where we can say, this is what you should be doing, this is what the plan looks like. I tend to talk about the plan in terms of the direction of travel rather than the plan. Most of our plans, if they're any good, are less than 4 pages long, because they're setting out the stuff that you've really got to pay attention to and the direction of travel that we're following. And then we're looking for a provider generally to work with us to start to deliver that direction of travel. What we've learned is we're not recruiting providers, we're looking for leaders. We're looking for people within organisations who are going to actually take personal responsibility for making this stuff happen. Who, if necessary, as was explained this morning when Robert was talking, people who will, if all else fails, they're going to do the job themselves. But they don't want to do the job themselves. They want to establish strong, intelligent teams that can do the stuff. So that's another key message. We have all this stuff going on. We have commissioning processes that basically seem to be more interested in your policies and procedures than actually what you do. That are more interested in whether you've got enough money in the bank not to be asking the purchaser too often to pay you. They don't seem to be particularly interested in how this is going to be sustained. And there's a sort of naivety about expecting that there's going to be some support from community services that's going to make life easier for providers. I don't know what you think, Neil, but from a provider's perspective, I very rarely felt supported by community services. I felt policed. I felt neglected. But once in a while you have somebody that is supportive. But yeah. So we sort of take the view that our providers have to be all things to all people. They have to, we have to develop providers that can work in a stress-reducing, autism or whatever is appropriate related way, but also can build networks, can build community, can make what they're doing part of the local place. And that means 9 times out of 10 that we're helping providers change to do different things. And that we're going to be around quite a long time supporting them. And the leadership we're looking for is again described in a model. This one's transformational leadership, but the leaders the way in which we look for leaders, or I look for leaders, is I'm looking for people who model, people who encourage, but from I think Shelley used the word hearts something this morning. From the heart, but heart to action. Yeah, well, I think we've got the same thing. The people that are being led know that that's where it's coming from. The people who create a vision and share that vision and help people contribute to that vision. And they're people who don't tell people what to do, they enable people to do it. And they are challenging the process all the time and finding better ways of doing things. So, any questions at this point? Good. Boring you to death, I know. Right. So we talk about not having a model, we have a framework. And it's consistently evolving, our framework. But, you know, it's just, this is not, as I say, it's not a model, it's a series of questions we ask ourselves as we do the work. So, have we asked how somebody wants to live? Do we understand what their best life could look like? Are we clear that what we're designing needs to be supplementary and complementary to a strong community, to a strong relationship base around this individual? Are we attending to building those relationship networks? Are we building that social capital? As you see on the notes against it, we've learned all this stuff from other people. We're just magpies. We just borrow other people's ideas and max them together. Are we paying attention to creating resourceful, resilient teams of people that will problem solve and will create opportunities and possibilities in pursuit of this direction of travel that we're following? Are we attending to ensuring that the person and the people around them are contributing to and helping build the community in which they live? When we look at services, supported living services, I'm often sort of, the image that comes into my head is one of those things where you've got the two-bladed helicopters. What are they called? Chinooks, you know. You've got a Chinook and you've got a cable coming down off it, and you've got a house on the end of the cable, and it's got a fence round it, and it's going to be dropped down in somebody else's community, and that's how it's going to stay, you know. Because lots of places that we visit seem to be like that. And when you say to staff, how do you get on with your neighbours? Or notice the pub down the road, how often you go there and whatever, who do you know? They don't know. They're not part of it. Are we paying attention to taking stress out of that person's life and the staff that are supporting them? Are we doing some behavioural management from a lower arousal perspective? Crucially, is everybody aware that we're on a journey? Our public sector people generally are looking at what we're doing as an episode. Something where they've written off, they've ticked off a plan, somebody's going to go away and do it, and nothing's going to change. And then when it collapses, we'll start again. We've always said, don't start with the money. Hard thing not to do. But we always start off with, how could we resource this plan without asking for any money? You always have to, doing the job we do. It's about us being the leaders until the leaders take over. And we have to demonstrate leadership all the way through. And leadership isn't about telling people what to do. Leadership is about creating more leaders. And we've learned in our business that if we're going to help somebody towards the life they want to live, then we're going to have to be incredibly tenacious. We're going to have to stick to the knitting, as Tom Peters and Waterman basically said all those years ago. And what we've added most recently to our list is this thing about changing the system conditions in which we operate. We now actively see that as part of our job. So we build and sustain systems, and we promote cultures that support doing the right things. So, any questions on that?
Could you talk a little bit about, so that first sentence, ask how you want to live.
Yeah.
Could you, I know there are multiple ways you do that. I wonder, could you expand that a little bit? How
Yeah.
you do that?
Every time it's different, and I guess every one of our directors does it differently.
Yeah.
For myself, it is about getting alongside somebody, and not just the person, because a lot of the people we work with, you're not going to get a lot because they haven't a lot of experience. So it's also getting alongside the people that love them and know them really well. And it's about being there. It's about being quiet very often. It's about being available. And it's about offering some thoughts, some possibilities. And when something comes up, maybe saying, well, why don't we go and try that together and see what happens? So there's a whole gang of different ways of doing this, but the base of it is what Rob was describing this morning. You know, it's that thing of, with Jay, the starting point is going and doing something with somebody. It's interesting, when the people we're working with in the east of England, you know, the guy with the clay, that's a Scottish one, yeah. Arthur. So, you know, the associate we've got working with him is incredibly experienced, very good woman. But she, you know, the people around him are scared to death of him. She just worked in, and the first time she met him, she thought, hang on, this guy'd love to make things with clay. So the next time she rolled up, she turned up with clay. That's what they do now. Yes. And she's got a relationship with him, and she's nearly got to the point where she's persuaded staff to leave her and say, I don't need protecting, he's okay. So, yeah, there's 1,000,001 ways of doing this stuff. Yeah?
Yeah, how does it work concretely? So when an organization comes to you for your intervention, do you always apply this checklist?
Yeah.
Always? So this
Always.
Is the starting point of each...
The checklist isn't a starting point or end point. It is, in terms of what we're doing, have we attended... These are the things we've learned that we have to attend to at some point in the process.
Okay.
Yeah?
And then through the process, you organize a follow-up and you see if the...
Not a follow-up, because it's continuous.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think that's the difference I was talking about. The systems people tend to see things in terms of episodes. So, for instance, if there's a care assessment done in this country by a local authority, I think a lot of local authorities will say to the person who's going to do the care assessment, you can have 2 sessions and then you've got to write it. You know, we don't work that way. And all the time we're doing the other stuff, we're still doing the assessment. It is, you know, just because we've written a plan doesn't mean we finished assessing. It doesn't mean that we stopped learning about an individual. And it doesn't mean that we won't change our minds. Or we won't give different priorities to things. It's about... The problem we've got, again, is that essentially the whole way in which social care in this country, and a lot of healthcare is done as well, is worked out on how many sessions you can have.
Well, it's very much talks to.
Yeah.
It's great. Local authorities
Yeah.
tend to operate on an episode.
Yeah.
It's about an episode. If you've fallen down and broken your hip or you've burnt episode, there's an episode of assessment that brings you out and chucks something out of you. It's always an episode.
Yeah.
And that's how it's constructed. So actually coming away from the episode and saying you've got to go on a journey with people and stay with them is quite a challenge to the system. But I think that's a good way of answering it.
Absolutely.
When
And the logic for us is to reinvent something we used to do. Not to try and be in the 1980s again, that won't work. But what we used to do was, instead of having a limited, you're working with these 20 people and you've got 3 weeks to get that piece of work done and then you move on. When I started my career, and I guess it was the same for Julie, I had a bit of a city. It was Coventry. Initially it was Willen Hall, and subsequently it was an area called Wood End. Literally, the area I worked in was about a kilometre or less square of streets. I knew everybody over a period of years. And you worked with, there were supposed to be caseloads, but I never remember taking them very seriously. And you might be working with 40 people at one point in time, and you might only be working with 10 at another point in time. But the whole emphasis was that you were on that journey with somebody, and it wasn't an episode, and it wasn't something that you had to finish because of you know, life isn't like that. Real life isn't like that. You know? And for me, the simple way forwards politically in this country, or organisationally within local services, would be to go back to working on local patches and to have what we used to call generic social work with people that will work with that community and would do community social work, would do group work, would do casework, you know? That makes sense? Yeah. Okay. So I've nearly finished.
Yeah, do your last slide though. I love your last slide.
You love the last line. All right. So this is how I feel about the world we live in. You know, I often sort of throw this quote. I don't know if outside of these islands people read A.A. Milne and Winnie the Pooh, do they? Yeah. But there's this lovely quote from A.A. Milne which says, this feels like our system. Here is Edward Bear, that's the system, coming downstairs now, bump, bump, bump on the back of his head behind Christopher Robin. It is, as far as he knows, the only way of coming downstairs. But sometimes he feels that there really ought to be another way, if only he could stop bumping for a moment and think about it. Yeah? So that's what we're asking the system to do, is to actually stop and think, maybe there is another way of doing this, as Rob was saying this morning. There is another way. There's somewhere else we can go with this. Okay, have I done to time okay?
It is more expensive for them, you know, and more resource consuming and so on. You know, sometimes it is like that.
Yeah.
Because you cannot stop just with the assistance, okay, doing that, and stop. No, because new problems appear. So you need to think on new problems. You need continuous support to these people, you know.
We would take a different view. We live through a political philosophy completely changing the way in which we were governed in as little as 3 years. They changed everything in 3 years. They created all the systems to change it. Now, if that can happen, it can happen again, you know, from our perspective. But there's got to be leadership to do that. We're not going to get leadership to do that from either of our main political parties. You know, not a hope in hell. Because of, you know, Thatcher was on record for this as well. When she was dumped by the Tory party and John Major became the Prime Minister, he surprisingly won the subsequent general election when everybody thought the Labour Party would win it and Neil Kinnock would be the next Prime Minister. And everybody knew that if Kinnock had become the next Prime Minister, he would have reversed what were called the Thatcher reforms. They were delighted that Major won, because when Blair came in, he didn't reverse the reforms, he regulated them. He introduced the notion of risk. He made everybody scared to death of risk. And he made it 10 times worse. So we've got a bigger problem here. But I see that operating in Europe. I see that operating in North America.
Yes.
You know, same thing.
Either way.
Yeah.